Welcome to Dialogue, a true crime conversation. I'm your host, Rebecca Sebastian, and today you are going to hear a story that has it all. Southern Victorian architecture, drugs and drag queens, a brutal murder, and real estate. I'm speaking with author David Dominé, whose book, A Dark Room in Glitterball City, released just last week and was given a nice write-up in the New York Times over the weekend. David tells the twisty story of two men, Jeffrey Munt and Joseph Banis, who stand accused of killing a man named Jamie Carroll, burying him under the wine cellar in an old, allegedly haunted home in Old Louisville, Kentucky. Jeffrey and Joseph each say the other did it, and they were lovers, so the story became known locally as a he said, he said. And if you're wondering about the Glitterball City part of the title, that comes from the fact that Louisville, Kentucky is the world's largest manufacturer of disco balls. Who knew? If you would like to read A Dark Room in Glitterball City, and I highly suggest you do, I am giving away one hardcover copy of the book. Just post a screenshot of this episode playing on your phone or car or wherever you're listening to Instagram or Twitter, and be sure to tag me at DIE-ALOGUE. DIE-ALOGUE. I will select a winner on Friday, November 5th. Be sure to follow me on Instagram and Twitter so I see your post and you see the winner announcement on Friday, November 5th. Now, here's David Dominé with more on this true yet almost unbelievable Southern saga. Let's kill the small talk. David, welcome to Dialogue Podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's great.
Well, we're here to talk about your newest book, A Dark Room in Glitterball City. It is your newest, but it's certainly not your first.
This is really my first real true crime book. I live in Louisville, Kentucky. I'm not a native Louisvillian. I moved here back in the 1990s thinking I was going to do a stint at grad school and get out of town, but the city kind of sucked me in. I ended up loving it.
And Louisville, it's interesting. It's a unique place. And the South is so rich with history and storytelling. And each city within has its own point of view and flavor. Can you talk a little bit about, because Louisville is such a part of the story and almost its own character in its own right?
Yeah. So Louisville, depending where you're from or where you're coming from, it seems it's always been a gateway to someplace else. And there was one particular neighborhood that I really liked. It was called Old Louisville. It's one of the historic preservation districts in this city. It's one of the largest historic preservation districts in the country. I thought I had seen it all. But then I lived in this beautiful old Victorian neighborhood with hundreds and hundreds of grand mansions and all this great architecture. I thought, how come I never heard about this? And so that neighborhood kind of sucked me in. It just turns out it's a bohemian kind of place, a lot of eccentric characters, and I love that kind of stuff. And so I ended up living in one of these old houses, and the person I bought it from kind of offhandedly told me the house was haunted. And I love ghosts and things like that, but I didn't really think too much of it. But I moved in and all these crazy things began to happen. And I'm not going to say that I'm still not a skeptic today, but I discovered people love ghost stories and they love legends and local lore and things like that. I was actually a food writer at the time, so I was writing cookbooks and restaurant guides and doing restaurant reviews and things for magazines and newspapers. Several years ago, I almost bought an old house and decided against it when the house popped up on the news several years later, and I found out a grisly murder had occurred there. When this murder made the news, when it broke, as details emerged in the first year or so and the second year, we found out all kinds of crazy things happened in this house. And the house kind of had its own life before, people moved in and this thing happened. I didn't know all the crazy angles it was going to take and all the different bends and twists were going to be in this story.
Okay, well, we will get to the case and what actually happened in that specific house. It's so crazy that, it was a house you were looking at. You and your partner lived down there. So let's get to the crux of the story, which is the discovery of this crime that happened in the basement of a Victorian mansion in Old Louisville.
So the evening of June 17th, 2010, around 9:30, 911 in the city received a call, and the call was from Jeffrey Munt. He was the homeowner at 1435 South 4th Street, telling them to hurry because he said he was barricaded in a bedroom on the second floor because he said his boyfriend, a guy whose name is Joseph, locals call him Joey, he said his boyfriend was at the door with a hammer trying to break through the wooden door to come inside and murder him. And the police arrived that night, but they thought they were at an apartment house because it was so big and they couldn't figure out how to get inside. Well, the whole time Jeffrey was on the phone with the the 911 dispatcher, and she was relaying instructions. And finally, he told her just to tell them to break in a side door. And they did. And they heard some steps on the grand stairs, and down came running Joey Banis with a backpack on his shoulder. And they made him lie down and they arrested him. They separated the two parties, and there were two officers, and each tried to get the respective parties' side of the story. In the process of talking to the two guys, Jeffrey and Joey, one of them said something about something down in the basement, and they didn't really take it seriously until the other one kind of confirmed something about somebody knowing something where a body was.
But the officers really didn't take it seriously until Joey gave them a name. Joey wanted to talk to a homicide detective, and when he did, he said he knew where the body of Jamie Carroll was.
He said Jamie Carroll was someone from the eastern part of the state, and that he had been missing for 7 months, and nobody even knew he was missing. They didn't really take him seriously. The police began calling around the eastern part of the state, and sure enough, within an hour or two, they found out, a guy named Jamie Carroll, a guy who had a hairdressing salon, he had been missing for 7 months, and no one knew he was missing until they started calling around. All of a sudden, they realized Joey knew something.
The police interrogated him all night, and eventually Joey broke down. He told them where the body was, down in the old wine cellar in the basement.
It was one of 2 rooms in the basement that had a dirt floor. And he said Jamie had been killed the year before, and he was in that dirt floor. And he said they had workers scheduled to come over that week and concrete it all over. So the police rushed and they got a search warrant. They came back and they started to dig. And you can see exactly what they found, because that night there just happened to be a camera crew in town from a show on A&E called The First 48. They recorded all this. The episode is called What Lies Beneath. And what they found below the surface of the dirt floor, 4 feet below, was a blue Rubbermaid container, and in it were the remains of Jamie Carroll. It was Jeffrey's house. He's the one that owned it. But he said he had no idea why there was a body down there. So he agreed to go downtown, and they questioned him. And he agreed to a polygraph test. But halfway through the polygraph, he all of a sudden changed his story. And he said, he did know about the body being there. But he insisted he only knew about it because he had been forced to help dispose of the body. He said Joey had killed Jamie and then threatened to kill him if he didn't help dispose of the body. He said he'd been living in fear of Joey for the previous 7 months. Well, when they talked to Joey, he said, no, Jeffrey killed him, threatened to kill me if I didn't help dispose of the body. And I've been living in fear of Jeffrey for the previous 7 months.
Not surprising, both Joey and Jeffrey were arrested and charged with murder. But it would take 3 years before they finally went to trial.
Locals saw something that was the most scandalous murder trial we had seen in a long time, and they called it the trial of he said, because they both pointed the finger at each other. They agreed to testify against the other in exchange for the prosecution dropping the death penalty. And some called it, because there was a kind of lover's triangle, because Jamie Carroll supposedly was a lover of Joey Banis. Some in the local press dubbed this the pink triangle murder as well.
Let's talk a little bit about Jamie Carroll. Sometimes victims are targeted for the very reason that they can go missing and nobody's going to be looking under every rock for them. And that's the sad reality. And Jamie fits that. Nobody was looking. And those stories just always break my heart a little bit.
So Jamie Carroll came from the eastern part of the state in a very small town, kind of coal country. And depending on who you talk to, there were different reports about him. But the people who seemed to know him, his friends, and the people, who knew him personally, they made it sound like he was a wonderful kid, growing up. And I talked to one of his high school friends who said he was very confident. He was openly gay in high school at the time, which
couldn't have been
easy.
easy.
That kind of surprises me, especially in that part of the state.
Yeah.
But they said he was very confident and talented. Later on, he got into performing drag, and he was quite a well-known drag performer in the eastern part of the state and in Huntington, West Virginia, where he had quite a following. So I talked to people who knew him from his days as Veronica Reed, the pageant queen. That was his stage name. And they all said he was very talented. And they all said he was very encouraging and supportive of other people in the scene, trying to break into the scene. So the people who knew him personally, they seemed to paint a picture of a wonderful human being. The people who had negative things to say were those that knew him in a drug dealing capacity. Sure. And Jamie was dealing drugs. That's been established. And you mentioned how Jamie came from a strata of society that was marginalized and that people wouldn't notice him if he went missing. And that was one of the prosecution's main argument when they laid out their case. The thing is, Jamie Carroll had supposedly shown up in town that evening, the evening of June 17, 2010, with the express intent of turning himself in the next day or so and going to jail and kind of doing his time. And from what I understand from people who had talked to him, he was going to try to do his time and come out and be on the straight and narrow. But Joey, who he had relationships with before already and who was buying drugs from him, heard that he was in town and supposedly said, come on over to the house and, we'll celebrate with you, because supposedly Jamie won last night out on the town before he turned himself in. And the guys, knowing that he was going to turn himself in, go to jail the next day, they were counting on people not missing him. And the thing is, had they shut up about it, they would have gotten away with it. Jamie didn't show up to his court date and they didn't do anything. They didn't put out a bench warrant or anything. And Jamie was often the kind who would disappear for months on end without talking to his family and friends. So his own mother didn't even know he was missing until the night of the 911 calls.
Oh, I always think about too how nuanced people are, and we're not all one thing or another, but we prefer stories where it's like she was the perfect angel of a victim, and how rarely that's true. Actually, I'm going to say it's never true. Maybe children excluded. You can use and sell drugs and also be an upstanding person with friendships and, passions and all of that. So that's heartbreaking and it is shocking. So let's talk about Jeffrey, because I thought his background was really interesting. I sometimes think of LGBTQ as like a marginalized group, and yet he had somewhat of a privileged background. Would you say? Is that too strong of a word?
No, both Joey and Jeffrey came from very good families and had very good upbringings. Jeffrey, he had gone to Indiana University on a scholarship, was very intelligent. He had actually just moved back to the Louisville area from Chicago, and he was quite well known. And he had restored a mansion on the lakefront in Chicago, in Evanston. And so he had some experience with privilege and living in big old houses and things like that. Supposedly, he had come back planning on coming back with a long-term boyfriend, but supposedly his boyfriend dumped him by text, and that kind of sent him into a tailspin. And he started looking for solace in, other forms. And that's supposedly how he met Joey Banis. Joey Banis, Joseph Richard Banis, is from a very prominent family here in Louisville. His father is a very well-known plastic surgeon, and everyone who knows him talks about what a wonderful human being he is and how kind. Joey, he had a very privileged upbringing, went to prestigious schools when he was younger, but he got into drugs and he did a lot of different things, but he was known as a bartender at one of the clubs in town. Joey had just served a stint in federal prison in Chicago, and he had just returned to Louisville. So Joey and Jeffrey met through an online dating site, and that's how they kind of hooked up.
And there's a little discrepancy between them about the nature of their relationship, right? Because it seemed that they were partners, and then I can't remember who said which, but the other was saying it was a little more casual than that, and that they weren't boyfriends. Can you verify? So
when Jeffrey made the 911 call, he told them his boyfriend was trying to break through the door. The thing is, it appears that they had broken up not too long before. You break up with someone, you still call him your boyfriend, your girlfriend.
Sure.
So I believe Jeffrey, that Joey was his ex-boyfriend.
I want to talk a little bit about who Jamie, Joey, and Jeffrey each are. In some ways, it's a tale as old as time, in that there's a murder, could be jealousy, lots of things can go wrong. We see that a lot, but we see it with heterosexual couples. And so I'm wondering, because this is not long ago, this was 2010 this happened? 2013 went on trial.
The murder, 2010, the trial's 2013. Yeah.
Right. This must have been huge news in Louisville. But why do you think it didn't transcend? Do you think it's that element that this was like a little bit too connected to a marginalized group of people?
I think there are two reasons. So it was huge in this area. And at first, a lot was made of the whole gay angle. There was that angle you could not deny. But that, I think, is one of the reasons why it didn't get as much national coverage, because press people didn't want to come across as sensationalize something just because they were gay and maybe appearing homophobic.
Interesting.
So I think that was a big reason why it didn't get more national coverage. But the other thing was these trials were going on at the same time the Jodi Arias trials were going on. And that had dominated the national news. I heard people say, had the Jodi Arias trials not been on the news, because that took months, they said this probably would have had more prominence.
I remember reading that, and it really struck a chord because, of course, I remember that trial. And I also interviewed her defense attorney, who her public defender, who desperately did not want to represent her. But it's striking to me because that's a highly sexually charged case as well. And so I just was thinking about the disparity between them. And the book goes into so much of kind of the subculture that they were involved in terms of S&M and all these things that, you know, even in 2013 and even now, like there's still some pearl clutching about, but we're okay with like, I don't know. I think there's other cases where we can handle it more, or we think it will sell more, you know, get more clicks and all of that.
There's just so many layers to this story that, I mean, you think you've seen it all, and then another layer to the story emerges. I think that's one of the things that's so fascinating about this all. So there were two separate trials, and the prosecution in both trials tried to paint it that Jeffrey and Joey were this inseparable team. You know, they did everything together as a pair. And that was their whole argument, that, you know, they did everything together, but then why at this moment when someone gets killed, why would they diverge and go different ways and then get back together and get back on the same track where they both dispose of the body and do all this stuff to cover it up. And that was pretty successful for the prosecution. But depending on the trial, each defense tried to paint the relationship differently to their advantage, of course. And of course, in the Jeffrey Munt trial, his defense is very successful. He tried to say, you know, they weren't even together that long before this all happened. They were only together a couple months. And so depending on which angle you were taking, it behooves you to either paint them as being together a long time or not a long time.
Right. It also really shows the difference, you know, how much an attorney seals your fate. It seemed like Joey mentions this to the police to sort of get out of trouble for the domestic dispute. Is that your best guess for the motive of being like, well, I've got info on this? Yeah,
and the detectives, the officers, I mean, that's all been well documented, that they had the impression that he was trying to get out of it, you know, in exchange for him revealing this valuable information. He was hoping that they would let him go. But in Kentucky, it's kind of a no tolerance thing. When someone is involved in a domestic dispute like this, they're automatically arrested. So there was no way he was going to get out of jail.
I'm just wondering about that rationality, though, of using a murder to get out of this domestic instance. And I know he was blaming it on the other person, but he's obviously going to be implicated in it in some capacity. Do you think drugs were clouding his system?
It had to be something like that. That's one of the big questions. Like, what was he thinking?
Yeah.
You know, I talked to my partner. I was like, we ever bury a body in the basement, you're going to shut up about it. You know, I was like, I'm going to shut up about it. You're going to shut up about it. So the only thing I can think is he knew that it was going down anyway, and he thought he might as well take Jeffrey with him.
Yeah.
That's the only rationale I can come up for it. And there's so many bizarre angles, like why they did stuff. And all I can think is they were so drug-addled, they weren't thinking straight.
That's what I wonder.
The more information that came out about Joey, he's kind of psychopathic, sociopathic.
Yeah.
And it might be just something that someone like he would do.
Fun fact, I use Stamps.com to mail merch and swag from this very podcast. It's true. If you've received a sticker, a magnet, or a pin from me, it has come to you via Stamps.com. That's why I am so happy that today's episode is sponsored in part by Stamps.com. Since 1998, Stamps.com has been an indispensable tool for nearly 1 million businesses. Stamps.com brings the service of the U.S. Postal Service and UPS right to your computer. Whether you're an office sending invoices, a side hustle Etsy shop, or a full-blown warehouse shipping out orders, Stamps.com will make your life easier. All you need is a computer and a standard printer. No special supplies or equipment. Within minutes, you're up and running, printing official postage for any letter, any package, anywhere you want to send it. And you'll get exclusive discounts on postage and shipping from USPS and UPS. Once your mail is ready, just schedule a pickup or drop it off. No traffic, no lines. Cut the confusion out of shipping. With Stamps.com's new Rate Advisor tool, you can compare shipping rates and timelines to easily find the best option. Save time and money with Stamps.com. There is no risk. And with my promo code POD, that's P-O-D, you get a special offer that includes a 4-week trial plus free postage and a digital scale. No long-term commitments or contracts. Just go to Stamps.com, click on the microphone at the top of the homepage, and type in POD. Again, that's Stamps.com, promo code POD. Stamps.com. Never go to the post office again.
Now, do you know why they weren't tried together? Was it just because they were accusing one another so they couldn't be co-defendants? I'm wondering why 2 separate trials.
Well, I think the prosecution realized the best way of getting a conviction was having one of them, testify against the other.
Yeah.
And the only way they could get that is if they dropped the death penalty in each case and did 2 separate trials.
It's risky though, no, to do it that way?
It was risky, and it might have resulted in, the second verdict being the way it was, because what happened is the second trial took place several months after the first trial, and they already had a conviction. So the defense was, they would say, we got the murder already, why,
They had a big mountain to get over in that second one. Yeah. How unlucky, I guess, if you want to look at it like that, for the first defendant. And if you're curious, which defendant and which trial came first, you're going to have to read the book. You are this ever-present figure during the trials, and the judge notices you, and you're kind of, you can't kind of just slide under the radar. Like, what was that like? Was this your first time covering a trial and attending? What was that like for you?
Yeah, it was my really first time in a courtroom like this. And, for previous books, I've interviewed people, and I've been exposed to some of this stuff, but this was just totally different because I was in the courtroom every day. And to do this kind of writing, you have to be kind of an investigative journalist.
Absolutely.
And I'm not really like that. I don't like getting under people's skin, and I don't like, bothering people. And so I was trying to do the right thing all along, but half the time I ended up stepping in it. And I was getting into trouble with the prosecution because I was trying to when I went to like offices and stuff, nobody knew what was going on. So they'd say, oh, call her. Well, I'd call the prosecution, like, you can't talk to me during a trial. I got yelled at for that. And then I had an interview during the trials with one of the reporters in Chicago. And so I tried to get out of the way so I'd be out of earshot of anyone hearing. Well, it turned out it was by the secret door where the jury comes and goes. So they reported me to the judge. I was just always like doing the wrong thing. But yeah, I was there every day. So that they realized pretty early on who I was and why I was there. And the defense attorneys, they both came and introduced themselves to me right away. And so they knew what I was doing and why I was there. But yeah, I was, except for an hour here or there for the second trials, I was there every minute of those trials.
And were there any moments where you were nervous for your safety, not inserting yourself in the story, but in a way shadowing it to where people did know and they were talking? Did you ever feel uneasy or scared?
I did have some threats, and one of the accused, let's put it this way, supposedly wields lots of power from behind bars and is able to get things done. So I'm not sure it was him, but I had a kind of a scare.
Yeah.
He's also the kind, the lawyer said, who will find out something bad happened and then try to take credit for it, like he arranged it.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I had a couple close calls. I'm hoping now that the book's out and it's getting a lot of publicity that'll be kind of a safety net for me, because there's this whole other angle that supposedly one of the guys worked for the CIA, and that's just one of these other bizarre, connections.
Yeah. So that reminds me about the whole counterfeiting money crime separate from the murder. Can we talk a little bit about their involvement?
That's another crazy aspect. The day that they were arrested, they were out on bond from a big arrest in Chicago in April of 2010. So while Jamie Carroll's body was down in their basement, the guys had gone up to Chicago, and they checked into the Hyatt Regency in downtown Chicago. And what they were doing is they were taking dollar bills and then bleaching them in chemicals and then taking the blank papers and restamping as $50 and $100 bills.
Oh my gosh.
So they checked into the Hyatt Regency for what I assume was going to be like a test run weekend to see how much fake money they could pass. And they must not have been very good because they didn't make it out of the hotel before they were arrested. They had given the doorman a fake $100 bill, and he knew right away. So he called the police, and they came and raided their rooms, found $54,000 in counterfeit money, in addition to bags and bags of date rape drugs, bomb-making supplies, guns, forged documents, and fake IDs. They were supposedly planning on, a bank heist while they were up in Chicago. They were going to kill two birds with one stone because of Joey's connections to organized crime from his prison days in Chicago, and because he had robbed a bank in Louisville already, they said.
So wait, how did they not end up in prison for that? They were out on bond?
Well, that's a whole, they were out on bond. And so the murder trial kind of trumped the counterfeit money trial. My understanding is there was supposed to be a huge federal trial about the counterfeit money.
I would think so.
It keeps getting swept under the rug. And that's this whole other aspect, this kind of murky part of whether or not Jeffrey did work for the CIA like Joey claimed. He said Jeffrey had worked as an assassin for the CIA, had killed 35 people. Jeffrey, during some time on the stand, said, no, that was a role-playing scene because they were into role-playing sexual scenes and stuff. He said, no, that was only a role-playing scene. Mm-hmm. No one really took the CIA stuff seriously, but I found it fascinating that Jeffrey is an expert in Eastern Europe, and he speaks Russian and German fluently and several other languages. And supposedly there were laptops that they were never able to break into that were encrypted. And supposedly there were pages and pages of text messages that never made it back from the translators that were supposed to be in German and Russian and things like that. So there's this whole bizarre, tangential stuff that just never really was dealt with.
Did the defendant who didn't end up going to prison ever face charges for the federal crimes?
As soon as he was released on parole in 2014, they arrested him again and took him up to Chicago, supposedly for the charges he was facing during that Chicago arrest. But I went up and I tried to sit in on that trial, and it took me forever to find out where it was and who the judge was in the courtroom. Well, I ended up there and there was nothing going on when I ended up at the courtroom.
So bizarre. You were in it as much as anyone else, if not more. Do you have your own working theory? Because I know there's outcomes that say, there's verdicts that tell us what happened, but it seems like people still have opinions that maybe contradict those outcomes.
I go back and I watch the trial tapes, which is a tedious procedure. But every time I read the story I wrote, something else pops up and I kind of second guess myself. And I tend to think the prosecution was kind of on the right track. It depends which trial you focus on because each painted a totally different picture. And the funny thing is, during the first trial, which is Joey Banis's trial, I went in there just from hearing things, out in public, and it sounded like he was the more guilty of the two. He's the bad boy that had a, criminal past. And so it was just kind of my research assistant, Carrie, and we went in there and we just assumed that, he was automatically guilty, but he was so articulate on the stand and he was so well-spoken and his story never changed. So actually after the first trial, we went in thinking Joey was the more guilty of the two, but we left thinking he was probably innocent.
Interesting.
Well, during the second trial, that changed a lot because there was a lot of information revealed in the second that wasn't revealed in the first trial. And then we started to find out more about Joey himself. And so I had a totally different opinion after the second trial. And the thing is, Jeffrey Munt got caught in lies on the stand in the first trial, some blatant lies. And there's 3 or 4 things I always come back to that make me think that he did have more hand in it than is maybe substantiated.
Okay.
And the thing is, but then when I saw him during the second trial and I heard the 911 call, they actually played this during the second trial. He was terrified. I mean, his voice is high pitched and he's crying. He's generally terrified. And his defense attorneys brought out all this stuff about Joey and this crazy stuff, how he He had GPS trackers installed on the car to monitor Jeffrey's whereabouts. They had a checklist of him getting out of prison, and the first thing he was doing was looking for a mark, someone to zero in on that he could use as a victim and live with them. And so Joey turns out to be a very calculating individual. And so as to the actual motive, that's the thing. Joey Banis's defense kind of painted it, and this brings in kind of the S&M stuff. They painted it that Jeffrey's ultimate sexual high would have been killing someone during sex.
Mm-hmm.
And the three of them had been in bed together. That's when the killing took place.
Yeah.
But depending who you talk to, one says he got off the bed and he turned around and the other was stabbing Jamie. So they both kind of say the same thing, but they say the other was doing it. So that was one possible motive. The other, Joey Banis's defense, painted it as just jealousy, like a woman scorned. Mm-hmm. He was with Jeffrey, and Jeffrey wanted him to drop Jamie, and he didn't want to be monogamous with Jeffrey. So that first trial, they painted it kind of as a woman scorned. The second trial, they painted it as Jeffrey had been living in fear of Joey this whole time, and he finally had enough, and he said, I'm going to call the police and I'm going to tell them. And Joey attacked him and tried to kill him because he wanted to stop him from going to the police.
Yes. Yeah.
So those are kind of the three main ones.
And they're all possibilities. And, meth does not help. This isn't the first murder we've seen where the assailants have been under the influence of that. It's a wild, wild story. Were you surprised by the homophobia of the jury? I'm thinking, I can't believe we have to ask these questions, but we do. Yeah. But in 2013, of course, they're asking people in the South their feelings and perceptions around gay men. And if I remember correctly, it seemed like the majority were honest and they did. A lot said they could put it aside. Did it surprise you, or is that your lived experience? What did you think?
I mean, being gay myself growing up and hearing that, no, it didn't surprise me. It was kind of heartrending to have it confirmed. And the thing is, during the trial, I mean, we heard blatant homophobic comments, about the victim and, the accused. So that wasn't surprising. But after everything had wrapped up and I was able to get the trial tapes and go back, and then you're privy to all the stuff that doesn't come out during the trials, like the voir dire, the jury selection and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was fascinating to see that today still we have that dinosaur mentality, but it is what it is. Things are changing. It was 2013. We've come a long way since, but there's still that mentality. There's still people today who are racist that think, black and white people shouldn't be able to marry. It's just ridiculous, but it is what it is.
Yeah. And I think it's, just another reason why I think your book is important. I think any story that humanizes the people in the criminal justice system, especially the victims, but even just understanding people's stories, even I would say the perpetrators, it's never a bad thing, giving people more dimension so that we can start making more room to care about stories that don't necessarily reflect exactly our experience. I don't think that's a bad thing. What do you think about, because you were considering that house, and then once you knew what happened there, could you get your head around living in a house like that?
So what I do is I kind of bookend with the first time I looked at the house, because I looked at it a second time as well. Of course, after Jeffrey Munt was arrested, the bank took the house and the price just kept tick-tocking down. I couldn't
believe the price.
It was down to $119,000.
Unbelievable.
And so we went and looked at it a second time, and I obsessed about the house for 2 weeks. I thought, oh my God, only $119,000. It's going to take hundreds of thousands to get it back, into shape. I thought, I could blog about living in a creepy old house and what happened. I said, paranormal groups, they pay to go spend a night in a creepy old basement where someone got murdered. I thought, oh my God, I thought there's so much I could do. And one night I woke up in my current house and it was like 3:30 in the morning and it was dark outside and it was quiet. And I thought, and this was while I was contemplating buying it, I thought, now, if I woke up in that house, knowing that right below me was the basement where a body had been for 7 months, I said, could I do that? And it just creeped me out so much. I had to reconsider. So I'm not going to say what happened because that's kind of a cliffhanger at the end of the book. Do I buy the house or not? But generally, I could get over a house like that. It's just houses have things happen. It's not
Yes.
the house's fault, even though in the neighborhood, the house has a reputation of kind of being a destroyer of life. So some have painted it as the house that is the monster. It's the house that takes over, and whoever moves in there kind of makes them do bad things. But I think generally the house is a house. Things happen there, especially when you've been around 120 years, like a lot of the houses in that neighborhood.
Yeah, if these walls could talk, I mean, that's where that comes from. Well, it's just fascinating. I love it. It's just a beautiful, I think it's like a perfect spooky season, fall, like chilly weather read. I'm really excited to share it with my listeners. Before I let you go, I do ask all my guests this same question, which is, if it was your last night tonight, what would your last meal be?
And that's another thing, depending on what kind of mood you get me in, it's going to be a different answer. It would be something with lots of carbs, I'm sure.
Yeah, go out strong.
Trying to do low carb, and all I crave is mashed potatoes and macaroni and cheese now. But I'd probably something simple. I think for me, it would be like a crusty loaf of white bread just out of the oven with some good butter and some really sharp cheddar cheese.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And a nice bottle of champagne with it.
Oh, I love it.
I'd be in heaven to have that.
Classic, yes.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully, yeah. And hopefully it won't be your last night anytime soon. Well, David, thank you so much for killing the small talk and being with me today.
My pleasure. It was wonderful to meet you. And like I said, you got a beautiful backdrop. It brings out your eyes.
Oh, thank you so much. Dialogue is a Yellow Tape Media production, audio engineered by Jason Usry and produced, hosted, and edited by me, Rebecca Sebastian. If you love the podcast, please consider becoming a diehard by signing up at patreon.com/dialogue. Other ways to support the show? Follow along on social media. We are at Dialogue Pod across platforms, and you can now watch most episodes on YouTube by subscribing to my channel, Rebecca Sebastian. For more information or to drop me a note, visit RebeccaSebastian.com. Until next time, thank you for listening and killing the small talk.